So a few domestics to get through. We're together for an hour, and you were everyone who signed up for the event was asked if they'd like to submit a question to ask about how to thrive at work. That's the title of the event. I actually received 8 questions, all of them of such high caliber that it did make me think I needed to go and do a whole other PhD to make sure that I answered them as proficiently as I could. And what was also really interesting is that there wasn't very much crossover between the questions either, so there wasn't really any repetition. But for me, that's really, really exciting because the questions are so pertinent. So how can I be sat here the other side of the screen answering these questions? So I'm going to give you just a quick intro to my background and why I'm here. And then I'm just going to get straight in with the questions. So my name is Jo Clarke. I'm a professor of psychology, and I spent about 25 years working in criminal justice. My first 2 years were with Surrey Probation as a community service officer, as we were called in those days, which I absolutely loved. And then about 20 years with the prison service, which was just the prison service in those days. And mostly that time was spent in high security prisons. When I reflect on that journey into criminal justice, I realise that as young as 23, which is such a long time ago, last century, I was really aware of the potential for this job to have an impact on our well-being. So at 23, the prison service were advertising for psychologists, and I was very clear that I was too young to work in a prison, but probation felt more manageable for me personally. And it was a couple of years later that I reconsidered a prison service job and joined as what we were then called a criminological psychologist, and then later a forensic psychologist. And now I don't practice forensically, so I just call myself a psychologist. I joined the prison service at Albany Prison on the Isle of Wight when there was talk of it becoming a centre of excellence in the treatment of sex offenders. And I remember again thinking, I think this really might do my head in. I don't really want to work with sex offenders. And I did resist for the pressure for a couple of months, but eventually succumbed. And actually what I found was that I loved the work, much to my surprise. It was very challenging. It was very difficult, but I kept my psychological balance mostly through that work. Moved to Brixton Prison in 1994, and we set up a unit for lifers who were facing release and suddenly considered to be a major risk of sex offending, even though their conviction had been for murder, and loved that work as well. But something happened that really triggered my interest in thriving at work, and it was when 2 of my colleagues from Albany Prison on the Isle of Wight took the prison service to court for psychiatric injury directly as a result of their involvement in SOTP. And that piqued my curiosity, having always been interested in the impact of the job, about why would they impacted in the way they were, and other people doing the same job didn't have the same impact, which meant for me that it couldn't just be about the job. There had to be other factors at play. So in 2000, I went to the University of York and I studied for 3 years under the supervision of a chap called Dr. Derek Roger, and researched specifically the impact of staff of working therapeutically with sex offenders. Went back into the prison service, was given my dream job of wellbeing advisor in high security prisons, and managed to put all that research into practice. And that's been my job ever since, really. I went back into academia for a while and ran a master's programme, and it's lovely to see there are some ex-students here on this call. And about 10 years ago, set up my own business called Petros. So petros.org.uk will get you to the website, and there are loads of free resources on there for you to follow up. And we are always happy to engage in conversation. So that's where I've come from and where I've been, and where I'm going is to continue to look at how do we ensure people have the best possible chance of thriving, particularly in jobs that we know put staff on the front line of potential trauma. These jobs are called critical occupations. That's what you're in, a critical occupation. So these are jobs where there is known exposure to traumatic incidents, experiences, paperwork. that may, under certain circumstances, exert critical pressure on the psychological well-being of those within them. And people in critical occupations also play a really critical role in protecting the communities they serve. So whilst that term was originally applied to paramedics and policing and disaster recovery staff, there has been an increasing recognition that staff working in criminal justice are in a critical occupation. So that's my raison d'etre, really, is to be working with people who do the jobs you do. And also, so someone not got their mic muted. I can hear some feedback. I don't know if it's me. Anyway, if you haven't, can you mute your mic? Thank you. But we work not just in criminal justice or in critical occupations. Now we actually provide services across any industry. So where there's people, there's Petros. But my heart is with you guys. So that's enough about me. We were going to be doing this as a hosted kind of chat interview, but unfortunately, John Scott, who was doing this work with me, is unavailable. So he was going to read out the questions and ask me to answer them, and I'm just going to do that myself today. And what I thought I'd do is just respond to these questions in the order that they came in to me. They are completely anonymous. I copied the question off the emails that I received and put them into a Word document. I have no idea who asked the questions, what grade people are. There were some brilliant questions, as I mentioned earlier. And I would love if you have got responses to anything I say to put them in the chat, and Steve will hopefully pick them up. We'll have maybe 5 or 10 minutes at the end with an opportunity to respond to anything else that comes in. So the first question I got asked, and I'm sure everyone on this call can relate to this, is how do you handle burnout when you're not able to take a break due to the nature of your role and the need to push through until you can take a break? And I could feel myself when I read this question thinking, why are we working in an environment where stopping and taking a break is not considered an essential part of top performance? Because it is. So I want to introduce you to the concept of energy management. And if you want to know more about this, there's a book by Jim Loehr, Loehr, and Tony Schwartz. And they were sports psychologists before moving into the corporate world. And they were looking at how do they distinguish people who were sort of equal on skill, but those who were going to really be world-class athletes. And what was fascinating is that they discovered it's what they do in their rest time. And their motto is that managing energy, not time, is the key to high performance, health and happiness. So they divide energy into 4 domains: physical, mental, emotional and spiritual. The book is called On Form, The Power of Full Engagement. And they are absolutely clear that the only time we can perform at our best is if we take appropriate rest, because you will not find an athlete in the world anywhere who just keeps running, just keeps throwing the javelin, just keeps jumping the high jump. They have to stop and rest in order to perform at their best. So my advice is, burnout comes from not resting. Remember, the question was, how do you handle burnout? Well, you shouldn't have to handle it. That makes me so sad that we're practicing in a way that we end up burning out. Whereas if we look at how we structure our day, how we take breaks, and I'm, literally 5 minutes, get up from your desk, walk outside of a door and take a deep breath in nature and come back, will shift your nervous system, will shift your psychological focus in a way that will enable you to perform better in the next period of time. Also, please bear in mind that research into human performance tells us that an hour and a half is the maximum that we can perform at any kind of level. And after that, our performance drops. And if you think about it, in our world, if our performance drops, we start making mistakes and we create more work. The human performance literature is so robust that it's built into law in professions where lack of attention is catastrophic. So air traffic control, nuclear power, those kind of industries. And by law, air traffic controllers need to take a break every hour and a half. I personally think it should be a legal requirement that we take breaks regularly. And I would break your day up if you can into hour and a half blocks probably, and build in 5 or 10 minutes breathing spaces. Make sure you get out at lunchtime. If you're working from home, make sure that you leave the house before you start work and come back into your house as if you are coming into the office. And at the end of your working from home day, leave the house and then come back in as if you're coming home. For more information on this, there is a blog on the Petros website about working from home, just to help you think about how you manage your day and you manage the emotional nature of the material that you're almost certainly dealing with, or some of the more tedious, boring stuff that you have to do as well. So my summary response: we shouldn't have to handle burnout. We shouldn't be getting to that point in the first place. I absolutely understand that the workload is ridiculous and we're often very short-staffed, but practicing some of these energy management principles is a game changer, and I really encourage you to do it. So, question 2. This comment is around the cumulative impact of challenging and distressing events and how to manage them. The person who asked this question had worked in probation for 24 years and has obviously dealt with lots of challenging events, but feels that the ability to deal with these is beginning to decrease and that events are becoming increasingly traumatic. Is there such a thing as a build-up of trauma over time? And that all these events add up to greater impact, and if so, do I have any tips for managing that? Wow, what a question. So a couple of things come to mind. I think it probably is absolutely the case that the more trauma we experience but perhaps don't process over time, the greater the risk that things will become more difficult and we become more sensitive to things over time. A couple of things I just want you to bear in mind when we're looking at policing. It's not new staff who suffer most trauma very often. It is those staff with 15, 20, 25 years in. And I think it's partly because our operating environments aren't conducive to us processing events as they happen. I think there is also another issue about, we think of trauma as being the really big stuff, and very often it's not the big stuff that trips us up, it's the small stuff. Another pointer that I'd like to make is that trauma isn't just inherent in the event that happens, but it's inherent in all the things that happen around that event. So whilst I may have been able to work with men who'd murdered old people when I was 25, and I didn't really have a very old person in my family that I was close to, my mum is now 88, and if I was working with somebody who'd murdered an 88-year-old in her home, it would have a very different effect on me. And I also was really aware when I had my daughter 10 years into working in the prison service that working with men who'd murdered children and babies, or working with sex offenders who'd offended against children and babies, was going to have a different impact on me compared with when I didn't have children. So I think there are lots of factors for you to consider and to think about in the context of what impacts you and what doesn't. And look around you and think, are there particular things that are pertinent to me at this time in my life that means this impacts on me slightly differently? Are there particular things historically that haven't been processed? And I work with quite a few people who've got PTSD diagnosed. By the way, I hate the word disorder. It's post-traumatic stress. It's not a disorder. To me, it's a psychological injury, and we should treat it in the same way as we treat a physical injury. But when we don't treat our psychological trauma, we kind of shove it away. And it reminds me, I don't know how many of you have watched Friends, the sitcom, that Monica, who's fastidious in her cleanliness and tidiness, has a cupboard where she chucks all her rubbish, and her boyfriend Chandler eventually finds this cupboard and opens it, and everything comes pouring out. And it makes me think about what we do with the stuff that we know and learn in these jobs, because I know there are things, once you see it or you hear it, you can't unsee it or unhear it. It gets stored somewhere. So things like debriefing, things like trauma disclosure, which is written disclosure, writing about how you're feeling, making sure. Personally, I think everyone should have a therapist and visit a therapist like they visit their dentist. So it becomes a preventative process, or a coach or a supervisor, someone you trust, and just process those experiences as they happen, make some meaning of them, discuss the emotions you have around them. And please remember that just because you have an emotional response to something does not mean you're not good at your job. That's another huge thing in our world. So I think there are things that you can do. And I hope that begins to answer that question. Question 3 is one that I am struggling to find an answer to that is unlikely to trigger somebody in my response to it. So I'm going to try and answer this really sensitively, because it's a question around people of different ethnic backgrounds. Do you have any specific advice for people who may have experienced discrimination, trauma, or racism at work? Would there be any guidance on how they can manage their resilience, well-being, and mental health in the workplace? Furthermore, how their managers and colleagues can support them in a different way to their white counterparts to manage well-being and mental health in the workplace following incidents? And I read that and I thought, I'm really not sure where to start, because there's so much in there. And the one thing that I'd never want to do is categorize a group of people altogether in terms of their responses based on one distinguishing feature. So not all white people are going to respond the way to mental health issues at work. Not all Afro-Caribbean or Asian people are going to respond in the same way. So I want to come at this from a very much an individual differences approach. And in the first instance, I will come back to the ethnicity and culture in a minute. I think undoubtedly people do experience things based on distinguishing characteristics, whether it's race or gender or gender choices, that can make things very painful and very sensitive. And I would really like, obviously, we've got lots of awareness, but I think there's some things going on, I understand, in the service that maybe even shut down conversation. I think we need to be really brave with how we address the particular challenges that individuals might face based on a distinguishing characteristic. But this is where I fall out a little bit with the idea of equality, because if we treat everyone equally, then we can't treat everyone fairly, because fair doesn't always mean equal. And so I believe we all have a responsibility to do as much learning and understanding as we can around the way different cultures and different ethnicities respond to mental health issues, because there are cultural differences. And this is what makes it really hard in the field, actually, of managing psychological well-being and mental health, because around the world, culturally, there are lots of different approaches to this issue. So I think managers ideally would begin to take some responsibility for learning a little bit about how mental health is dealt with in different cultures, and that would be really helpful. And I think we need to be really brave in our discussions. I can see there's a hand up, so I'm going to stop what I'm saying and ask what the question is.
No, it's just me, Jo. I was just wanted to say to the audience that at the end of this answer, it would seem like a natural point at which people can come in and maybe make any comments, challenge anything that you've said, or support anything that you've said, because we want to make this as interactive as possible. So if you stick your hands up, I'll call you out in the order that you come in.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, because this isn't an area where I have expertise. My expertise is people generally, I'd like to think. But I do, obviously, I work with people from all sorts of different backgrounds and cultures, and with all sorts of different things. Oh, Black Minds Matter, that looks like something that might be useful for people. So it isn't an easy question to answer. I'd love to think we lived in a world where it didn't make any difference to people, but sadly it does. And I think there are also things we can do to skill ourselves up. I know, as a woman working in prison, particularly in 1990 when there weren't women in prisons, I did a lot of learning very quickly to learn how to manage myself and others in that situation. So a collaboration is what I would want for everybody, and some courage and bravery to be open and honest about some of the issues we face, and a commitment to learning. I'm not sure that's really answered the question, but I'm very happy to have another go at it.
Thanks, Jo.
Okay, should we come back to the questions afterwards so that we
Yep,
can get
sure.
through the other questions? Is that okay? Thank you, because I'm sure there are people on this call with a lot more expertise than me, and I would love to hear from you. When work is busy, how do you resist the temptation to firefight and not mirror the chaos? Ensure you make time to anticipate issues, plan your responses and strategies. I love this question because I think very often what happens for us when we are feeling overwhelmed, our mind races ahead to all the things that we have to do and doesn't stay on the thing that we currently need to focus on. And we somehow, with that overwhelm and that pressure, lose the ability to prioritize. And we do just feel like we are lurching from one thing to another, often quite absent-mindedly, and quite often feeling really, really stressed. So in that chaos, I want to give you some techniques and tips that you can use, because I also really want you to go away with some tools from this. So we actually at Petros run a whole training called the Challenge of Change Resilience Training, and I've taken these tips from there, and you can look that up as well on a website, thechallengeofchange.co.uk. But one little acronym that I think is an absolute lifesaver is WIN, and it stands for what's important now. And what we mean by that is, what's it important I'm giving my attention to right now? So I'm going to issue you with a bit of a challenge. You've committed to come on this call. We're here till 1 o'clock. I'm going to ask you to see if you can give your full attention to this call. And when your mind starts thinking, oh God, I've got a million emails to do and a meeting to go to and an offender coming in for supervision, that's not happening now. What's happening now is this call. So I want you to connect with your senses, to come to your senses, such a good, come to your senses, but nicely, and connect with your sense of listening and just give your full attention to what you can hear. And while you're giving your attention to that, your mind can't be doing anything else. It can't be running off to the future and it can't be running off to the past. It will just be present. And it is so simple, this technique, and it is a lifesaver. Because, you know, when you're at home in the kitchen doing your washing up at 9 o'clock at night and you suddenly go, shit, completely forgot to sign that report or finish that thing or send that email. And you can't do anything about it now because all that stuff's in the office. So what's important now is that you give your attention to your washing up. It is that simple. Practice while you're driving, because our attention disappears when we're driving, and that's very dangerous when we're behind the wheel of a weapon of mass destruction. So when you're driving, focus on your driving. Do a running commentary of your drive if it helps, so that you keep your attention in the car. So WIN, what's important now? Another very similar one, but one I kind of almost prefer, is be in the room you're in. So if you are physically in a room, have your mind in that room with you. Don't let your mind be somewhere else. You know, when people talk about sleepwalking through life, it's because their mind is absent. So they don't know what's going on around them now. So when there's all that chaos and there's that temptation to firefight, focus on what's important now and consciously shift your attention from one task to another. If you're doing something that's a priority and then something else comes along that's a bigger priority, stop doing what you're doing and give your attention to that other priority, but do it consciously. Know that you're doing it. And I'm absolutely confident that if you put those little strategies, what's important now, be in the room you're in, try a running commentary, you will find everything just slows down a little bit and feels a bit more manageable. My mum's life tip to me as a child, don't arrive before you get there. Absolutely. What a lovely tip. Yeah, stay here. Here's all right. So just stay where you are. Next question. And Steve, I'm going to ask you to keep an eye on the time because I have no clue how we're doing. When colleagues are struggling and the general work atmosphere is low or waning, what's the best thing to do to support colleagues and lift team spirits? And my answer to this is, it depends who you are, and it depends who you are in your relation to your colleagues. So are you a peer? Are you a manager? Are you a more junior member of staff? Because there's some really interesting research by Jo Clarke, who is, you may know, some of you, she's still in the civil service somewhere high up. She did a really nice piece of research back in 1996 about what's considered supportive by grades of staff to people who were working with sex offenders. And colleagues, peers, what was considered supportive was like swapping shifts if there was a family commitment, or or just asking how a session had gone. Whereas for managers, it was things like asking about the work and how it had gone, supporting debrief time, making sure planning time was protected. And then for more senior leaders, it was attending awareness. You know, some of the staff, frontline staff would say, you know, I'll know if my senior leader, the governor of the prison or the head of probation, has attended the awareness training, and that feels really supportive. So have a think about who you are looking to support, and think about what you might practically be able to do. Because sometimes, you know, we all talk about I'd have a chat or I'd listen to somebody, but that might not actually be what they need. What they might need is a cup of tea and somebody to take a case off them for 5 minutes, or take a phone call or send an email on their behalf if they're really struggling. So nice practical things that you can do. So I love the question right now, what do you need? What do you need from me right now? What can I do? And if we all did that for each other, you can imagine how nice that would be. But I think so often we've got our heads down, we're blinkered, we don't see. So the second thing I'd say is really see your colleagues. We ask a question in training sometimes, which is, you can tell if somebody is struggling or not, and everyone very politely says no. And then you ask people to identify how you know if someone was struggling, and they come up with a million things: withdrawn, more irritable, looking a bit grey, not as chatty as usual, all those sorts of things. So we do know when people are struggling. And I think when we ask that question, how are you, in this country, it's actually not an inquiry, it's a greeting. So if you're going to ask that question, ask it as a genuine inquiry. And when someone says, oh, I'm fine, perhaps you can then say, no, really, how are you? I genuinely want to know how you're doing today. And if there's, you know, what you need, is there anything I can do to support you? So being seen and heard for me is like a fundamental element of the human condition, and particularly true from our more senior people. If I know that my boss has got my back, I will probably walk through fire for them. So if you're a manager, see and hear your staff as much of the time as you can. If you're a peer or a colleague, ask what people need and see what you can do to help. And hopefully we can begin to shift a culture which is like heads down and blind to everything else that's going on around us. Next question: when something goes wrong, and acknowledging that the legal professional steps might be taken, how can we take collective responsibility and avoid undue focus on the individual through accepting that this sometimes may not be the right approach? And the example given was Lucy Letby. There's probably, the person who asked this question thought it might be a poorly worded question. I think it's a really good question, but want to talk about the importance of accepting that things go wrong before we can carry on with the job and keep positive and focused and support colleagues. So we have a lot to learn in criminal justice from what are called high reliability organisations. And I think it's worth getting to know a little bit about how these organisations run. So high reliability organisations are organisations where an error would be catastrophic. So air traffic control is a good example, nuclear power, the gas industry. You know, that if somebody misses something, or somebody doesn't respond to a concern that somebody else raises, the results of that would result in multiple deaths. Now, we might not end up in multiple deaths in our field, but we all know there are cases where mistakes have been made or something's been missed where it has resulted in loss of life. And I think we would be very wise to learn from high reliability organisations. So what are the things about those organisations? Well, first of all, it is very much a learning culture. Now, I'm not talking about you changing the culture of the whole of criminal justice, because you can't, but you can do it in your teams. When you think about what the culture is in our organisation, it's us. We are the culture. So if we're all silent, we have a silent culture. It takes an enormous amount of courage to be the first person to speak out. But once we have a culture where we are curious and inquisitive and want to learn from things that go a bit wobbly, we begin to change that culture. So don't underestimate your power in changing the way things can go sometimes. Another element of high reliability organisations is deference to expertise. So it might not always be the most senior person who's got the answer, and senior leaders need to understand that the expertise may well be lower down the grades. So as a very simple example, there's a major chemical spillage in a chemical plant. The CEO almost certainly won't know what to do, but the cleaner will. And so there is deference to that person's expertise in that role. And in your teams, you will have people with specific expertise that no matter what the grading structure would be ideal to defer to, because it really helps that learning culture. There's also a thing called built-in redundancy, and this is where one colleague questions and checks what another colleague is doing. I've actually seen this in practice more recently, because somebody very close to me has cancer and I've been with her through chemotherapy, and I'll see the first nurse read out what they're doing from one chart and the second nurse reads out what's happening from another chart, and they marry that up to make sure she gets the right chemo, because they get it wrong and it's a bloody disaster. So, and we can do the same in our work. We can ask people, I think I've done all the things I need. I think I've taken into account all the things I need to do for this particular risk assessment, but I would really appreciate a second eye over that. I'd really appreciate your experience, your perspective, and then not get defensive when they say, well, do you know what? I probably wouldn't have given it that score. I might have considered it this way. Have you thought about whatever? So let's start having those conversations that breaks down our defensiveness, that we have to be perfect at everything all the time, because we can't be. And it's a crazy expectation. So I hope even we can do it in teams of 3 or 4. Let's make that change in our small teams, and let's hope it filters from the bottom up. I know you are seriously up against some huge cultural things, but I don't want you to lose sight of the fact that you have more power than you think. And I know, because I've done it in my own practice in criminal justice too. And I did have to take a deep breath and hope that I wasn't going to get sacked, but I never did. I never got sacked. They can't afford to lose you. Okay, so be brave. Any tips for switching off, good work-life balance, and not dreaming about the job? So actually, this is not unlike the busy firefighting question, I guess, but I took this to mean more about how we are at home. And I'm going to go.
You've gone on to mutual. Yep, you're still showing on mutual.
Am I back?
You're back.
Oh, I don't know what happened there. I didn't even touch anything. All the pressure. Anyway, I'm back. Okay, so we were talking about switching off at work and good work-life balance, and I was talking about taking your mind with you. Don't be there before you need to be there. Be in the room you're in. All of that really helps. However, when we are quite overwhelmed and stressed and we've got a lot going on in our lives, sleep is often the first thing that gets disrupted. And it's a little bit like you go to bed, you lie down to go to sleep, and then your mind kicks off. And it's the equivalent of being in the car and sitting at some red traffic lights with your handbrake on and having your foot on the accelerator. Because when your mind starts getting busy, it's pumping adrenaline through your system, and the last thing you're going to be able to do is sleep. So I would really recommend some really good sleep hygiene. There is all sorts of experts out on YouTube and everything else. My particular favorite is a woman called Narina Ramlakhan, Ramlakhan, Narina Ramlakhan. 3 books she's written, all very similar. You only need to read one of them. Tired but Wired, which I love. Fast Asleep, Wide Awake, and The Little Book of Sleep. I've read Fast Asleep, Wide Awake, and The Little Book of Sleep. It is full of really good tips to help you build a routine. I think sleep is training. I think you can, I know you can train yourself to sleep well by following tips. So when you're lying in bed and your mind is busy, if you can't focus on what's important now, which is just maybe listening to your heartbeat or following a meditation or relaxing your body. Those are really good things to focus on. If you really can't do that, get up. Don't lie there trying to get to sleep, okay? Because otherwise you're just pumping the adrenaline. The other thing is it's very, very normal to wake up in the night. People are fearful of waking up in the night, but actually it's completely normal to do it. What's not normal is to then start risk assessing how tired you're going to be the next day. So if you do wake up in the night, don't look at your clock. You know, if you've got to have a clock in your room with a light, switch it, put it upside down so you can't see what the time is, or dim it or something. Get up and go slowly, go back to bed. If you can't get back to sleep, get up and do something boring like the ironing, or read a book, but don't go on your phone because it's all the, you know, about all the light and stuff. But don't worry about waking up, because it just causes more and more pressure. Okay, but anything by Narina Ramakant or anything else that you like the sound of in terms of sleep hygiene to bring you back to that balance. The one thing I would say, we've got an assessment that we use to look at the factors that predict thriving, and there is a very strong relationship when levels of diligence that people have, their conscientiousness, and a really poor work-life balance. So whilst undoubtedly some of what is going on is just too much to do with too few staff, that is absolutely the case. You are just one person, you cannot save the world, and you are much better to your employer and to your colleagues if you pace yourself, you practice energy management, you sleep well. Everyone is in a much better place than if we are all stressed out and overwhelmed. So by taking those 10-minute breaks every, 3 or 4 times a day or whatever, we can actually probably end up being 100% more productive. Okay, so don't feel guilty for leaving your seat for 10 minutes. It's really important to do. Okay, I've got one more question. Woohoo! And then we can go. Oh no, I haven't. I've got loads. Okay, I'm going to try and be quick with this. Should some people be discouraged from working in a certain occupation with high levels of stress? My straightforward answer to that is yes. I was very unpopular when my job was recruiting psychologists, when people had a history of mental ill health and we'd refer them to occupational health and they'd say, make reasonable adjustments. And I'm like, how do you do that for somebody's head? You can make reasonable adjustments for physical issues. You can put ramps in and grab rails and things like that. But if somebody is susceptible to anxiety or to stress, working in a high reliability or critical occupation is probably not the ideal environment. And I have encouraged people to leave for the sake of their own well-being. We can't all do everything. I could no more be a paramedic than fly. Can't cope with blood. I'd love to think that I can, but I can't. So my straight answer is yes, I think people should be discouraged. I realise I'm not going to be popular for saying that. In some cases, why does a particular situation or incident trigger more of a response than others? And I think we need to look at what's going on for us in our lives at any given time to help us understand. So this actually goes a little bit back to the first question about or the second question about the build-up of trauma. So I think I mentioned then, I could work with people who'd murdered elderly people when I was younger because I didn't have elderly people in my life, but now it would affect me. It would make a difference depending on how tired I was, how my home life was going, my relationships with my team. So there are lots of things that can influence how you manage something at any given time that you may have managed completely differently at other points in your life. On the front page of the Petros website, there's a free downloadable ebook called Workplace or Wellbeing in the Workplace. I should know, shouldn't I? Wellbeing in the Workplace. It's free for you to download, and at the back of that, it introduces you to a model, and it's got some case studies in it which can help you understand why you might be impacted by things at any given time. So please feel free to help yourself to that. Driver motivation. It would be interesting to touch on driver motivation and what would contribute to lack of it, and how the causal relationship between them and well-being and job satisfaction works. I'm going to go back to a few things I've mentioned, actually. I think it's not unusual for people in roles such as yours and mine to commit ourselves to helping other people and ending up burning out or having compassion fatigue, because we're very driven by wanting to help, to do good, personally me, to rescue people. And when that drive is so hard, it's really difficult to stop it. but actually I can do those things much better if I look after myself first. So there is that issue of putting your own oxygen mask on before you help other people, making sure you're fit to do it. And the other thing is, if you're one of those people who's very good at offering help but not taking it, listen to Brené Brown, because she is very clear that if you cannot accept help yourself, you're not really in a good position to offer it to anyone else. And that really pulled me up by my bootstraps. Thank you, Brené Brown. I think we also sometimes get so overwhelmed with the amount of work we do that we lose touch with why we're doing it. And all of us have our own very personal set of core values. And the people that I've worked with, maybe in a coaching or therapeutic capacity, who come through the door to the bone tired, not something a good night's sleep or a good meal or some exercise is going to fix, are the ones who've really deviated from the values that they hold very dear to themselves. So they're not, there's no oil in the machine for them. They're not getting anything back from what they're doing. So I think revisit your core values. What are they? Why did you choose to work in probation? What do you love about what you do? And what gets in the way of you having a good day at work? And two simple lists to generate, they'll probably come to you quite easily. What do you love about what you do? What drives you and motivates you? What gets in the way of a good day at work? And of those things that get in the way, are there any that you can change? Are there any that you're going to need to radically accept? Or is it so awful that you actually do need to consider moving into something else? And that's okay. That is okay. We're all so frightened of feeling like we failed, or that we're going to let people down, or that it's too difficult. But you know, sometimes the change is what's needed. Not always. There are lots of other things we can do. So make those two lists first and discuss them with someone who really gets you, who really cares about you, and just see if you can make some changes to get your mojo back. How can organisations tangibly support their frontline workers beyond encouraging individualised self-care to work through the frustrations regarding systemic failures in the justice system that are not repairable on an individual level? What a great question. I could do with another few days to answer this, but I'm going to rather bravely talk to any senior people on this call, and if there aren't senior people on this call, perhaps you could draw their attention to this. There is so much research out there that tells us what we need to do to build a culture that allows people to thrive. And I think the more we experience staff burning out and leaving, and my colleagues back in 1995 taking the prison service to court, my response to that is ignorance of the research is not a defence against doing nothing and enabling a culture where people really struggle. So controversial as that might be, I know from acting as an expert witness, not in the prison or probation service, but in the police service, where policies and procedures haven't been practiced, the research hasn't been even considered in putting things into place. So, for example, we know that environments where there is rigid, inflexible adherence to bureaucracy, where there is a blame culture, where there is not encouragement of people to pace themselves in their work, we know that there are higher rates of post-traumatic stress in those organisations. So if we know that, we need to do something to make sure that changes. Senior leaders, sort of middle managers, who have a really horrible job because they're sandwiched between the front line and the top, but you do have a lot of power in how your teams run. And I think it would be really good to talk to peers and colleagues. We run a training called Mind Health for Managers, and although I love the training and personally I think it's really good, what the managers mostly get out of it is that sense of cohesiveness between the managers who are on it, and those sharing experiences and backing each other up in decision making and so on. So, you know, if you've got a team of 20 or 30 people, it might really be worth thinking about, what can I do in my bit of the world? What does the research say about what might help? So energy management, certain types of training, certain procedures that you use or protocols that you run in your team, have a look at them and see what you can do at your level. But I'm really speaking to the guys at the very top and saying something needs to happen to prevent people getting damaged by their jobs, because it is completely, in my view, preventable. But anyway, that might get me a bit political, so I'll stop talking now. My last question, I really want to leave time for questions, but this one's about concern for colleagues and the team that we're acting and a bit afraid to be honest about our mental health through fear of being judged. What advice could I share for helping to foster a safe working environment? I would say it would be a really good practice to introduce no holds barred debriefs at the end of the day, where people can just say how they feel without any fear of judgment about the fact I felt furious with that offender, I felt scared by that one, I felt really happy with that one. I loved when my colleague asked me how I was and offered to make a phone call on my behalf. To have those debriefs to allow ourselves to be emotionally open in the workplace. There is a time and place for emotional openness, but if we set debriefs aside, that can be really helpful. I think we need to reframe emotion and what it is to be human. We are emotional animals. We sometimes live in a culture, and this goes back to cultural issues, where the expression of emotion is seen as weakness. To me, that's like saying if we find something funny, we shouldn't laugh. You know, the fact that we don't cry if we find something sad is weird, because we'd always laugh if we find something funny. So crying is an emotional response. It's a behavioural response to an emotion in the same way that laughing is, and we need to normalise that, taking account of time and place, and just recognizing that emotional responses don't make us bad at what we do. They probably actually make us better. One of the things we did in the prison service was introduce decompression sessions, individual and group, for staff with specially trained facilitators, and they were literally safe spaces to just decompress, or exactly as they sound, phenomenally popular. We started those 16 years ago in high security discrete units, and as far as I know, they're still going. So if you know anyone who works in a high security discrete unit, do talk to them about decompression sessions. And again, we've got a thing on the website about what they are, and maybe you could even set them up yourselves. So I'm going to stop. I think I've answered every question. I'm slightly out of breath. I'm going to take a sip of tea while I allow Steve to come back and let me know if there are any other questions to answer.
We haven't had anything in the chat. Annette, if she's still on the call, did have her hand up for a while, but she's taken it down. Annette, are you still there? Do you want to come in and ask Jo some questions?
Sorry, hang on, I'm just turning everything on. Yeah, I mean, I partly I just wanted to clap and keep clapping, because I think this is probably the most useful hour of at least my week, possibly the year. The team that I work in are focused a lot on human factors, and a lot of what you've been saying links in really well to that. So I've got loads of stuff to feed back. And I guess one thing that we've started to do within our team in terms of how we deal with diversity is I myself have ADHD and complex PTSD, and I've been able to say those things in my team. And the agreement that we've made is that we start every meeting with a well-being session where we go, this is what I need, this is what's happening for me right now. And that we each take individual personal responsibility for how we treat each other and other people in the organisation. So instead of there being, we seem to always have this kind of throw something at it approach where we set up big programs that are meant to change everything, and they don't, because I think people get initiative weary. And so if we can encourage people to take responsibility for every single conversation, every single report, every single interaction, then I think that's how you change a culture from, not from the bottom up, but from across.
I so agree, and for all of that, having your mind in the room with you is what you need to do those things, and it also so reduces stress. So I honestly, I want to clap now. So thanks, Annette, so much. I think that would be really helpful for everyone listening. So
thanks, Annette.
Thank you.
Gary Jackson says, do you think HMPPS are doing enough to provide mental health support to frontline staff? And what's one thing you would like to see, Jo?
Well, first of all, I'd love to change the term from mental health to mind health. That would be my first stop, because when we hear the term mental health, we automatically think mental ill health. We don't think about good mental health. Whereas well, not everybody, but most people do. So if we talk about mind health, it's the same as physical health, and there's no judgment about whether it's good or bad or up or down or whatever. So I think we need to start talking about mind health, and I think we ought to think about it in the same way we do physical health and safety, that we think about psychological health and safety or mind health and safety in the same way, because we would not tolerate in physical health and safety people being injured regularly by their job. And legally now, actually, the Health and Safety Executive will not accept having mental health first aiders as the totality of somebody's response to mental health at work. So it's about working practices, it's about space and timings, it's about structuring your day, it's about being appropriately trained, it's being about working to your values. And the organisation could do a lot more, in my view, that most organisations can do a lot more than they do. I'm not slating HMPPS. I know it's a massive government machine. It's really difficult. But I think there is a lot more that could be done. But I love what Annette was saying, and I hope everyone else agrees that we can make some of that change happen. We have more power than we think, but we do need support from the top. Happy to chat to anyone who will listen, because there are things out there. Yeah.
So we have we still have about 5 minutes left or so. So not often you get access to someone of Jo's caliber. So if you've got any issues or questions, fire them in there. Got some nice comments in the chat there for you to read, Jo. Any further questions? Anything anyone would like to challenge? Oh, look, here we are.
Daniel
your old student, Scott. He wants to come in and go get her, Daniel.
Be careful. We have a past.
Yeah. This takes me back 10 years. It's more about like sharing something, and I wonder whether you could add to any of this. You know how you mentioned about asking somebody how they are, how they're doing. And in itself, I think that's actually a bit of a skill, isn't it? When you're like, because it's not, especially in English culture, you just go by and you're like, oh, how you doing? Yeah, fine, see ya. But the actual, I think one has to be really careful when you're asking how are you really, even if it's over a phone call, because the pressure we're all facing, especially as frontline staff and also managers, they're not exempt of this whatsoever. They have their own pressures that sometimes are sadly overlooked or not understood. And I think it's just about perhaps getting a bit more guidance on how can that question be asked as safely as possible, because when somebody is, has a massive, I don't know, with probation, with the workload management tool, and they're on like 140%, and it's one crisis after another, and they forget to really look after them. And the whole system in place is obviously, as we all know, and we can agree on, it's not great for us, what you call mind health, looking after the mind health. Asking that question in a safe space, that's what I think should be perhaps looked at a bit more, and how could we do that? Because it can really be traumatic, can't it? It can be.
Yeah. Do you know, I mean, you're right, it is really hard, but it's also really easy. We sometimes get asked if it will provide specific training on how to have the conversation, and we would have to train somebody in 7 billion different ways of asking it, because every single one of us will have a different need. And I remember once on a training course, a man had disclosed that he had had mental ill health, and at the end of it I said to him, thank you so much for sharing that in the group, because it was really helpful. Please let me know if there's anything I can do for you. And he launched at me and he said, I don't know what you can do for me. What can you do for me? And my immediate response was to go, oh, steady on, so back off. But actually, he had a really valid point. So I just apologized. I just said, I'm really sorry. You're quite right. Didn't mean to offend you. And I've had like 30 years of training in this field, and I still get it wrong. So I think what I'd say in response to your question, Daniel, is that ask the question only if you've got time to listen to the response. Otherwise, don't, because you're going to be in trouble. But I think so. I would say to you, so hi Daniel, how are you doing? And you say, yeah, I'm fine, thanks. And I go, no, but really, how are you doing? I'm fine, you might say. And I say, well, I know you say that, but I've just noticed recently you're not as chatty as you usually are, and I just want you to know that I'm thinking of you. That's it. And sometimes that can be enough. If somebody says, actually, I'm not fine, life is really shit, then that's why you need the time. And I say, right, let's get a cup of tea. I think what I'd really love to encourage you to do, although God, I feel like I'm promoting my own work, but anyway, look at the online workbook, Wellbeing at Work, because in there are lots of examples of different types of intervention, sort of primary interventions, secondary interventions, and tertiary interventions. We've got loads of tertiary, send people off to counselling and therapy and rehab. We have very few primary and secondary. So it will be interesting, even in teams maybe, to think about what resources you've got, how you might signpost or support. Sometimes, though, it is just enough to give someone 10 minutes, and don't feel like you need to solve their problem, because you can't. You know, let's say somebody says, well, actually, the reason I feel like it's not work at all is because my marriage is breaking down. All you can do is say, I'm so sorry to hear that. Just talk. Can't solve it. I'm not a marriage guidance counsellor, but I can listen. And just being heard sometimes is enough. So I absolutely agree with you. It's quite a sensitive thing. But on the other hand, we're all humans. We all do actually get it. If you don't think you've got any skills in asking that, then some people won't. Not you personally, Daniel. But if somebody says, oh, God, I feel really uncomfortable asking that question, maybe someone else can ask it. And that's okay too. Or you might just take a cup of tea to somebody who's sitting there with their head down like this, and you might say, I made you a cup of tea. I know for me, I tell you what, I've just a little bit of personal disclosure. I've got a lot of stuff going on at the moment with cancer and Alzheimer's and really difficult stuff. And I came home with loads of medical appointments, and my housemate took my washing out the machine and put it in the dryer. And it nearly made me cry. But it was so thoughtful and so appreciated and took such a load off. So there we go. So sometimes you don't even have to ask the question. You could just do something. Put a flower in a vase on their desk, or drop them a funny text, send them a ridiculous meme off Instagram that is going to release serotonin or oxytocin or something. Just something.
Thanks, Jo. Just before you finish,
Thank you very much.
I'm going to do something and just add a bit of personal disclosure myself, just to try and maybe reassure people a little bit that it's not all bad. I'm sitting here today as your insights contact, which makes me a civil servant sitting in a big bank of civil service desks with 1,000 other civil servants. But it wasn't always this. I've got over 40 years in the game, and I started off with the military, and I started off through fairly traumatic tours of duty there. I moved on to the police in Glasgow. I was a policeman in Glasgow for a number of years, so you can imagine what that was like. And it was only, I guess, 20 years ago, I moved into the field of probation work and all the rest of it. So having had that journey, I'm going to do something I don't usually do and defend the organisation just a little bit, because what I can tell you is that after military service and police service, with all the horrifically injured people and dead children and all the stuff I had to deal with over those jobs before I grew into what I am today, nobody ever asked me back then, how are you, and is there anything we can do to support you or help you? There was nothing at all. You know, after a particularly violent incident, the way that it was dealt with by senior officers in the police service was, yeah, you want to see it at the weekend if you think this is bad. So what I would say on behalf of the organisation, and this is just my view, perhaps it's not your experience, but having been that journey, it has become more on the radar. It's more in people's minds. Hang on a second, we work in very difficult situations sometimes. We see awful things, we hear awful things, we speak to awful people, we deal with awful people, and there is now some attention to the staff group. So there has been progress, Jo. I think that's what I would say. So I think it's just as a bit of balance there, having come from a long way back. So just want to say thanks, Jo. Just looking at the time, perhaps some closing remarks from you, Jo, before we go.
I haven't planned any closing remarks, but I would just like to say, having been in criminal justice, and at a time actually when I think we were much better off, certainly financially, I think you're all doing extraordinary jobs. And I think you owe it to yourselves to make sure you've got your oxygen masks on, that you make sure that you fulfill your duty of care to yourself. And I think there is actually what you said, Steve, it is very easy to be angry at the organisation, but the civil service is such a huge tanker. And if we wait for that to turn around, you know, we're going to be waiting a very long time. So I would really encourage you to do your little bit at home, your little bit for you, and look after yourself, because you are so vital to the safety of our communities. So I'd like to say thank you very much as well. And it's been a delight to be here with you today. Thank you.